Section 20 of From Metternich to Bismarck by Lionel Cecil, Jane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8, The Fall of Austria, Part 1. In order to tear away from the puny figure of the Emperor of the French that giant's robe of deceit in which it was so deftly enshrouded, and to expose to the astonished gaze of Europe the insignificant proportions of that colossus before whom a continent had trembled, a man was required, dishonest enough to discover the fraudulence of another, and willing to reveal his discovery. Such a man was found in Otto von Bismarck, Prussian Chancellor, unmasker of the fictitious man of destiny, destroyer of the empire of insincerity, creator of a new empire of frank self-seeking. His very defects contributed to his success, since they were joined with and corrected by singular clearness of political vision. Less sincere than Metternich, he escaped the Austrian Chancellor's error of allowing his supreme contempt for sentimentality and for the rights of peoples to blind him to the importance and influence of enthusiasm. Lacking Mazzini's loftiness of purpose, he was able, unlike the founder of Young Italy, to realize that idealism, however exalted, may strive in vain if unsupported by material strength. Deficient in ardor, he was not guilty of that rash contempt for the devious paths of diplomacy which characterized the ardent Garibaldi. Inferior in subtlety to Napoleon III, he was free from that exaggerated belief in hypocrisy which marred the promising career of the imperial comedian. Profoundly convinced that in politics there is a time for lying and a time for truth-telling, a time for sentiment and a time for cynicism, he considered that to use all means to gain the desired end, to despise no agency, however contemptible, is the part of the practical statesman. And Bismarck was before all a practical statesman. Others might believe in the high destiny of the German race and in its sacred mission for the regeneration of fallen humanity. Such distant ideals were not for him. For mere unity he felt but a qualified enthusiasm. It was for unity under Prussian leadership that he longed with all his heart, for which he strove with all his might. Attainment of this end might or might not benefit Germany as a whole. It would assuredly benefit the kingdom of the Hohenzollerns, and therefore attainment was to be desired. Bismarck set one clearly defined object before him. He would secure for his country and for his master that imperial crown which Frederick William IV had declined to receive at the hands of the revolutionaries of Frankfurt. And pursuing this object, he would not allow his eyes to be blinded by idealistic visions, or his heart to be tormented by sentimental regrets. Nor was he one whit less practical in his realization of difficulties and his devising of means by which his end should be gained. Like Cavour, he recognized that in politics only a limited perfection is attainable, that lesser evils must be endured if greater evils are to be escaped. But unlike Cavour, because he was less prone to idealism and more clear-sighted, he was patient and able to avoid the pitfalls into which too hasty progress would have plunged him, as it plunged the great Sardinian. Had he been minister to Victor Emmanuel, Napoleon III would never have appeared as the deliverer of Italy, nor would the Pope, by continued residence in Rome, have distracted the new kingdom. For Bismarck could wait. He preferred the most heart-breaking delay in gaining his objects to their rapid but imperfect attainment. He was determined that when unity was secured, it should be real and complete, founded on the sure basis of ultimate power of compulsion, the outcome of superior strength. His Germany was to be no palace of sentiment. There should be no half measures, no concessions, no sharing of power, no foreign help. Prussia would unite the fatherland by force. She would dictate her own terms and overawe rather than conciliate any opposition which might arise. And thus a necessary first step was to secure for the Hohenzollerns that commanding position which should enable them to work their will in Germany. But at the moment of his accession to power, Bismarck found little in the situation to lead him to hope for immediate success. When the storm of revolution had spent itself, and the brief Saturnalia of liberalism had ended in the triumph of Schwarzenberg at Olmütz, reaction had run riot in the Confederation. Austria, no longer satisfied with that moral supremacy which had been Metternich's ideal, aimed at complete ascendancy, and found ready allies in the lesser states, who viewed with mingled distrust and jealousy the recent self-assertion of Prussia. Nor did that power offer any serious opposition to the court of Vienna. Frederick William IV, never a man of powerful intellect, had been reduced to a condition of pitiable weakness by the turmoil of the year of revolutions, and while Manteuffel feared to enter upon any vigorous policy, the king tended in his declining days more and more to give way to that curious fascination which the Habsburgs from time to time exercise over their neighbours of Berlin. And though the constitution of Prussia was retained, it failed to inspire liberals with confidence, and did little more than afford opportunity for violent strife between the progressive and feudal parties in the state. None the less, there were signs of approaching improvement. The unitary sentiment, though repressed and discouraged, had not expired. The Frankfurt Parliament had stirred the imagination of a race whose superficial stolidity is but the cloak of a poetic temperament, and its failure was less remembered than the hopes which had been built upon its meeting. As Germany slowly recovered from the political paralysis which had fallen on her with the return to reaction, leagues were formed to promote the cause apparently so lost. The National Union undertook the advocacy of a closer federation under the leadership of Prussia. The Union of Reform, unwilling to deliver the German subjects of Francis Joseph into the hands of Magyars and Slavs, proposed to include their Austrian compatriots in the united fatherland. And though such diversity of opinion somewhat impaired the efficiency of the agitation, the two leagues served a useful purpose by keeping alive the idea of unity, and by making the reform of the Germanic Confederation a theme for constant discussion. And the prospect of such discussion producing a tangible result was appreciably increased when the restless soul of Frederick William I at last found peace, first in imbecility and then in the grave. The government of Prussia passed into the hands of his brother William, a man of sterner mould and greater stability of character. He possessed neither striking mental capacity nor remarkable originality. His natural enthusiasm had been diminished by the advance of years. He was perhaps incapable of devising a policy or of inspiring a crusade. But he was endowed with a large measure of good sense. Not very wise himself, he could appreciate wisdom in others, and above all, he was loyal to his servants and steadfast in support of any course which he had once approved. Nor was the limited intelligence of the king altogether a disadvantage. Had his mind been more active, William I might have found it impossible to submit to direction by a minister. As it was, he recognized Bismarck for his mental superior, was content to rely upon him, and to cooperate heartily in carrying out the policy of his servant. Such abnegation was more easy because the Chancellor was at one with his master on the solitary point concerning which that master held decided opinions. William, who had been the hope of the militarist party in the days of revolution, was above all things anxious to reform the Prussian army, in which serious defects were revealed when it was mobilized to support Austria against Napoleon III. Thus, even before he had actually ascended the throne, he undertook the carrying out of such changes in the military system as might give to the monarchy that armed strength which was the tradition of the days of Frederick the Great, and which Bismarck considered as one of the most necessary preliminaries to the realization of his aims. A genuine universal conscription was established, and though the Parliament refused to sanction the creation of new permanent regiments, those new regiments, secured provisionally as a result of the mobilization, were none the less embodied. Forthwith, a constitutional crisis arose. The lower house protested that it alone could grant the necessary supplies. The king fell back upon the theory of his divine right, and upon the powers possessed by him as warlord. It was to solve the deadlock thus created that Bismarck was called to office, and it was his success in this task which secured him permanence of power. His methods were direct and characteristic. While declaring that the claim of the lower house was unjustified by the Constitution, and proceeding to raise revenue with the assent of the upper house and by intervention of the royal prerogative, he undertook also the destruction of an irritating and inconvenient opposition. Secure in the devotion of the army, he borrowed the methods of Napoleon III. Official candidates were forced on the electorate. The press was stifled, and the angry protests of enthusiastic meetings were ignored. This vigorous action proved completely successful. Parliamentary resistance to his policy ceased to be important. The reform of the military system was completed. Prussia became, beyond any question, the possessor of the most efficient army in Germany, and one great requisite for the attainment of his ultimate aim was secured. Yet, valuable as this efficient army was, it was not the most valuable asset possessed by Bismarck. Still more important was the Zollverein, the customs union between Prussia and the other German states. Founded soon after the Congress of Vienna by some of the smaller members of the Confederation, it had been gradually extended until Austria was the only state which stood outside it. Her non-inclusion had been due, in the first instance, to the blindness of Metternich, who had long failed to understand that by allowing the Zollverein to develop under the aegis of Prussia, he was preparing the way for her political by conceding to her commercial leadership in Germany. And when the court of Vienna at last saw the danger, the question of the non-German territories of the Habsburgs proved a bar to her admission, despite the readiness of many members of the League to welcome her adhesion. Protracted negotiations ensued, but the influence of Prussia was used to render them futile. As Austria was irrevocably committed to a policy of high protection, the Zollverein was reorganized on a free trade basis, and this stroke was soon followed by the conclusion of a commercial treaty between the members of the League and France. A divergence in commercial interests was thus produced between the German states and the Habsburg monarchy, while Prussia, able decisively to affect the material welfare of the Confederation, possessed a powerful magnet by which to draw her neighbours into political union with her. But though in this way she had improved her prospects of securing the headship of united Germany, the conduct of Prussia served also to bring into relief the strength of Habsburg prestige. The smaller states were ill content to see their traditional leader treated less favourably than their traditional foe. They lamented that advantages accorded to mere Frenchmen should be denied to the millions of good Germans included in the motley array of nationalities under the sceptre of Francis Joseph. And their sympathetic grief was intensified when Austria, abandoning her old preference for reaction, appeared as the champion of reform in Germany. The court of Vienna invited the various princes to meet at Frankfurt and to consider a scheme for the reorganization of the Confederation, which was to be placed under the direction of 6 states, including Austria, Prussia, and Bavaria, assisted by a federal council and an elective General Assembly. 24 governments accepted this proposal with enthusiasm. The obstinate hostility of Prussia caused her to appear as the advocate of reaction, and though the scheme necessarily failed, its production served to revive the waning popularity of the Habsburgs in Germany. Bismarck, who had been early cured by his experiences in the Federal Diet of any partiality for Austria, and who had become a convinced supporter of her exclusion from the Confederation, saw that he must find means of breaking down the sentimental bond which united Germany with Vienna. And he found this opportunity in the reopening of the Schleswig-Holstein question. These two duchies, together with that of Lauenburg, were possessions of the king, but not part of the kingdom of Denmark, and the succession to them was disputed between Frederick of Augustenburg and Christian of Glücksburg. The latter, who represented on the female side the elder branch of the Danish royal family, had been recognized as heir to all the territories by King Frederick VII, by the powers in the conventions of London, and England and France had guaranteed the integrity of his dominions. But this decision had not been accepted in the duchies, which claimed that in them the Salic law prevailed, and that Frederick of Augustenburg was therefore rightful heir to the dukedom as representing the direct male line. And this resistance to the declared will of Europe was complicated by the ulterior aims of Schleswig-Holstein. It desired and demanded autonomy, which was threatened by the centralizing policy of the Danish king. In reality, it aimed at independence. Nor was this the only complication. Holstein was a member of the Germanic Confederation, and Schleswig was indissolubly united with Holstein. The liberals of Germany wished to absorb both duchies, and in any case were resolved not to sacrifice their compatriots to the Danes. Matters therefore remained in a critical condition, despite the Convention of London, and on the death of Frederick VII in 1863, a crisis occurred. While Christian was duly proclaimed at Copenhagen, the duchies declared in favour of Frederick VIII. They insisted on their right to local independence, and they demanded that their estates should be convened. And when the Danes looked to the Western powers for help, their enemies turned to Germany, where sympathy for the duchies was great, and so vigorously expressed as to stir to action even the slow-moving Diet of Frankfurt. In response to pressure from the legislatures of the various states, the Germanic Confederation pronounced itself officially in favour of the Augustenburg candidate, and a committee of 36 was appointed to superintend the enforcement of this decision and to organize, if necessary, the federal forces for a campaign against Denmark. But Bismarck had no intention of allowing the question to be settled without his assistance. He realized how much Prussia might gain in naval power by the annexation of the duchies or of their seaports. He saw also an admirable opportunity for embroiling Austria with her friends, the German states, and he was successful in persuading the court of Vienna to join with him in urging Christian to grant autonomy to Schleswig, and when this suggestion was ignored, in occupying the duchies. A brief campaign ended in the triumph of the two powers. The Danes, appealing to the guarantors of their territory, received only mild diplomatic support, and the Treaty of Vienna, 1864, was concluded, by which Christian ceded his rights in Schleswig-Holstein to the Allies. Those Allies conveniently forgot the claims of Frederick of Augustenburg, in whose cause they had been professedly fighting, and organized a provisional administration for the duchies without regard either for the wishes of the inhabitants or for the rights of either claimant. It was, however, found more easy to dispossess the Danes of territory than to settle the future of the occupied land. Bismarck, secretly resolved on annexation, would not agree to any other practical suggestion. His initial proposal for the recognition of Frederick was obviously insincere, since it was coupled with conditions such as the cession of Kiel, which would have rendered the duchies incapable of preserving even the semblance of independent existence. The Duke of Augustenburg declined to accept the proposal unless it was ratified by the estates of Schleswig-Holstein, a reservation which was tantamount to rejection, since the Prussians had become thoroughly unpopular in the occupied territory. And Austria was equally unwilling to agree to the next suggestion of the Court of Berlin, an open proposal for annexation, with the result that the two powers were soon on the verge of war. While the Prussian member of the provisional government laboured to advance the interests of his own country, his Austrian colleague showed signs of wishing to fulfil the moral obligation to secure the accession of the Duke of Augustenburg. If Bismarck had had a free hand, Austria would have been punished for her tentative honesty by an immediate declaration of war. Nothing would induce the Prussian Chancellor to forego his expectations of advantage from his actions in Schleswig-Holstein, and least of all would qualms of conscience do so. But the influence of William for a while preserved peace, and his minister was obliged to content himself with a mere diplomatic victory. He induced Austria to sign the Convention of Gastein, 1865, by which Schleswig was handed over to Prussia, Holstein and Lauenburg to her ally, the latter duchy being immediately sold to the Prussian king. Formal annexation was not announced, but it had in effect been accomplished. And once more the Court of Vienna had been guilty of a fatal blunder. Her action in the duchies had already brought her into conflict with the federal army, which the Diet had sent to support Frederick, and had offended the sentiment of Germany. Now the Convention of Gastein was hailed not merely as an outrageous breach of faith, but also as a deliberate violation of the Constitution of the Confederation. The smaller states expressed their anger in protests at Frankfurt. The two powers threatened to punish such impertinence, and forthwith the Habsburgs lost much of that sympathy which would have been invaluable in the struggle which was to ensue. Austria, in fact, had been utterly outwitted. She had been led in pursuit of a supposed immediate advantage to impair the true basis of her influence in Germany, and when the hour of conflict came, in place of finding behind her a united body of opinion, she with difficulty secured the support of a bare majority of the states of the Confederation. Moral influence had been her greatest asset. Her immorality at Gastein lessened that influence at the very moment when she most needed it, and when it would have been most valuable to her. For her position at home was not such as might enable her to face war with equanimity. She had indeed escaped the imminent peril of dissolution which had faced her, and under the firm guidance of Schwarzenberg she had temporarily restored order throughout her dominions, but that good order had not long endured. The death of its creator had thrown power into less capable hands. His successor, Bach, though continuing his system, had not realized to the same extent that it was upon force and force alone that reliance could be placed, that the army was the only basis of the existing order. While adopting to the full the idea of merging all the conflicting races of the empire in one centralized state, and while repressing with vigor all manifestations of national sentiment, he also believed in a close alliance with the Church. By the Concordat, 1855, which he concluded with Pius IX, the supremacy of the emperor in ecclesiastical affairs, established by Joseph II, was abandoned, and by creating the impression that they were devoted to the maintenance of Catholic ascendancy, the Habsburgs added to their many other difficulties the alienation of their non-Catholic subjects. More unpopular than ever, the government maintained a precarious existence with the help of an army already faltering in its devotion. And thus the government fell as a result of the shock of its defeats in Italy. Bach resigned. Francis Joseph announced the prospective grant of reforms, and finding that the mere inclusion of representatives from provincial diets in a central assembly at Vienna was not enough to conciliate his liberal subjects, he restored by the diploma the powers of local assemblies, and revived the institution of separate ministries for Hungary. But the Magyars were not yet content. No sooner had they regained their own diet than they declared that they would only recognize the constitution which Ferdinand had accepted. They hinted that Francis Joseph had never been received as king at Budapest, and ignoring the central committee which was to represent and to govern the whole empire, they reverted to passive resistance. The Austrian dominions appeared to be fast returning to that state of anarchy which had followed the fall of Metternich. But Francis Joseph was at once firm and optimistic. Refusing to concede the demands of the Magyars, he tried the experiment of a new constitution. While the local diets for each country in the empire were retained, a general parliament of 2 chambers was created to represent the whole monarchy. But when it met at Vienna, its failure was at once obvious. If the advocates of unity had been satisfied, those who desired federation were profoundly disgusted. Hungary, Venetia, and Croatia declined to elect deputies, and in the first of these countries the agitation was serious enough to necessitate the proclamation of martial law. Francis Joseph realized that unity was at present unattainable. He recognized also that with a discredited army, and in view of the increasingly hostile attitude of Prussia, the Magyars could hardly be held down by force. In these circumstances he suspended the new constitution as unworkable, and accepting dualism, the slackening of the bonds between Austria and Hungary, until only the kingship of the emperor united them, he opened negotiations with his high-spirited subjects upon this basis. These negotiations were still proceeding when war with Prussia broke out. End of section 20. Section 21 of From Metternich to Bismarck by Lionel Cecil Jane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 8. The Fall of Austria, Part 2. Of this conflict, the ostensible cause was the support given by the Austrian administrator of Holstein to the Augustenburg party and to the agitation for independence. But in reality it was the result of Bismarck's determination to exclude the Habsburgs from the united Germany which he projected, and the war would have occurred even if Schleswig-Holstein had never existed. For the struggle was no sudden event. The Prussian Chancellor had prepared the way for it with all his accustomed thoroughness and all his accustomed realization of the needs of the situation. Aware that Austria single-handed was no match for the reformed Prussian army, he laboured to deprive her of all possible help. And his labour had been crowned with success. By concluding a military convention with Russia for the suppression of the Polish rebellion, he had won the gratitude of Alexander II, who could not fail to contrast, and that with advantage to the court of Berlin, the friendly attitude of William I with the more dubious conduct of Francis Joseph. And having thus disarmed the possible hostility of the Tsar, Bismarck turned his attention to the even more congenial task of deceiving the arch-deceiver. In an interview at Biarritz, and in a private conversation with Napoleon III, of which the details were not committed to writing and are therefore unknown, he succeeded in convincing the French Emperor that he would do well to allow Prussia a free hand against Austria. It is probable that he led his dupe to imagine that he would receive assistance from Berlin in an attempt to annex Luxembourg. In any case, France remained neutral, and Italy, who would hardly have dared to enter upon war without the implied sanction of Napoleon, was left free to bid for the completion of her unity by throwing in her lot with Prussia. Thus Austria was isolated in Europe. A belated attempt to disarm Italian hostility by the offer of Venetia failed, and in the final struggle the Habsburgs could rely only upon the assistance of the minor German states. That assistance, such as it was, she received. When the Prussians, professing that Austria had broken the Convention of Gastein, denounced that treaty and expelled their late allies from Holstein, the Diet decreed federal execution against the Hohenzollerns. The recent misconduct of the Court of Vienna was forgotten, nor did the minor states allow the attractive scheme of reform, which was published from Berlin, to cloud their eyes to the danger of Prussian aggression. Yet the effect of Austrian folly was seen in the doubtful character of the majority by which help was granted to her, and that help proved to be small compensation for the lack of any more substantial alliance. Indeed, a large part of the Federal army took the field so late in the 7 Years' War of 1866 that the war had been decided before they entered upon the scene of action. Prussia acted with such decision as utterly to disconcert her more leisurely foes. Placing 3 armies in the field, she had assumed the offensive while her opponents were still discovering that war had broken out, and the decisive victory had been gained long before the Allied forces had completed their concentration. The opposition of the northern states ended with the capitulation of the Hanoverian army at Langensalza, and Berlin was delivered from all peril. In the south, the Bavarians were defeated, and Frankfurt occupied with the greatest ease, the federal capital being treated with exceptional harshness, as though the victors desired to emphasize the decease of the long moribund Germanic Confederation. But meanwhile the real issue had already been decided by the overthrow of Austria herself. Having conquered Saxony without a battle, the Prussian armies almost surprised Benedek, the Austrian general, who was slowly advancing northwards, by their sudden invasion of Bohemia. The defenders of that country fell back in some disorder upon Königsgrätz, where Benedek, hampered by instructions from Vienna and deprived of all initiative, was reluctantly compelled to give battle. The needle gun with which the Prussians had been rearmed proved fatally effective, and at the end of the day Austria had ceased to be a German power. And her defeat in Bohemia cost her also her position in Italy, neutralizing the effects of the victories which had there crowned her arms. While the Prussians were pouring across the Saxon frontier, the Italians had invaded Venetia, but at Custozza their military inferiority was once more painfully exemplified, and their army hurled back in confusion. Nor did they fare better at sea. A projected attack on Trieste was defeated at Lissa, where their fleet, though of superior strength and more modern construction, was easily dispersed by Tegethoff. Such gleams of success smoothed the path which Francis Joseph was forced to tread, but they could not save him from pursuing it. Königgrätz made the Peace of Prague inevitable. For, with the Prussians almost within striking distance of Vienna, further resistance was hardly possible. Only with the help of Hungary could the war be continued, and the relations between Hungary and Austria were not so cordial as to encourage Francis Joseph to emulate Maria Theresa and throw herself on the generosity of the Magyars. Even if he had been assured of an equally favourable response, he would have been reluctant to appeal to subjects recently on the verge of rebellion, and it was by no means certain that the response would have been favourable. Though Hungary had loyally refrained from embarrassing the government during the war, Kossuth, supposed representative of the noblest and most influential section of his race, was urging the Italians to capture Trieste and thus give the signal for a new revolution at Budapest. And though the exiled patriot possibly misunderstood his countrymen this once, Francis Joseph determined not to risk the addition of civil war to his other calamities. He invited Napoleon III to mediate between him and Victor Emmanuel, ceding Venetia to France as a first step along the road to peace, July 1866. And since Bismarck was almost equally anxious to end the war, progress along that road was rapid. The Prussian Chancellor had aimed at the exclusion of Austria from Germany. Having realized this aim, he was wise enough to understand that he would probably rather lose than gain by pressing his advantage. For Napoleon III was already gnawing at the diplomatic net in which he had been entangled. He was beginning to debate whether he had not been deceived at Biarritz. Signs were not wanting that he contemplated a reversal of his policy. And Bismarck, being by no means anxious to involve himself in a second war before he had garnered the harvest of victory in the first, was also convinced that if German unity had an enemy, that enemy was to be found rather in Paris than in Vienna. He foresaw the inevitable contest with France. He felt that a hopelessly alienated Austria might intervene in that contest with fatal effect, and he believed it to be in his interest to avoid such hopeless alienation by judicious leniency in his hour of triumph. In these circumstances, it was not hard to reach an agreement. Under the nominal mediation of the French Emperor, preliminaries of peace were arranged at Nikolsburg, and were soon converted into the definitive Treaty of Prague. Francis Joseph was not greatly humiliated. No indemnity was exacted from him, nor was he compelled to cede any territory, Venetia having been already surrendered. But he was obliged to retire from all participation in German affairs, to assent to the annexation by Prussia of Schleswig-Holstein, Hanover, Hesse-Cassel, Nassau, and Frankfurt, and to the formation of a North German Confederation, which was to include Saxony and all the states north of the Main. In other words, Austria had suffered final defeat in that struggle with the Hohenzollerns for the leadership of Germany, which had raged intermittently since the days of Frederick the Great and Joseph II. And her defeat in this struggle decided the issue of another and almost equally time-honoured contest. Deprived of her German position, she was unable further to resist Magyar demands, and when the negotiations interrupted during the war were resumed after Königgrätz, their result was a foregone conclusion. The cause of unity had been lost on the Bohemian battlefield. The dispute was no longer between a unitary and separatist party, but between the two wings of the latter. The question to be decided was whether the alleged blessings of local independence should be confined to the Magyars or extended to the Slav races also, whether the dominions of the Habsburgs were to be organized as a dual monarchy or as a federation under a common sovereign. The advocates of the dual monarchy triumphed, and their triumph was the work of a Magyar patriot and a Saxon professional statesman. Francis Deák was free from the extravagant localism of Kossuth, whose declaration of independence he had condemned. He believed that devotion to Hungary was not necessarily inconsistent with loyalty to the Habsburgs. But at the same time he was Magyar enough to oppose with all his might any concessions to mere Czechs and Croats. There might be a parliament at Vienna and at Budapest, but there ought not to be a parliament at Prague, and there most decidedly should not be one at Wagram. And under his influence, dualism carried the day in the Hungarian Diet, and as that body was almost in a position to dictate its own terms, dualism was perforce accepted as the basis of settlement. But the details of that settlement remained, and their arrangement was entrusted on the side of Austria to Beust, whom Francis Joseph summoned to Vienna after the Peace of Prague, much as Dion invited Plato to Syracuse. A professional organizer of states, the new minister was given a free hand to reorganize the tottering Habsburg monarchy, and more especially to determine the conditions which Austria might secure from Hungary. He performed this arduous task with credit. The strength of the state was to some extent maintained by the establishment of common ministries for foreign affairs, the services and finance, in so far as the last concerned expenditure for common objects. Its material prosperity was protected by a system of consultation and periodic agreements on commercial questions. If dualism has succeeded, its success must be attributed to Beust. If it has failed, its failure has been due to the reactionary character of the system. For at the very moment when Austria and Hungary were thus agreeing to differ and amicably drawing up a separation order, the unitary movement was advancing rapidly across the frontier. Freed from the embarrassing presence of the Habsburgs, strengthened by the addition of those lands which she had annexed, Prussia found herself in the position to hasten towards the goal of her ambitions, and Bismarck did not neglect to avail himself of the advantages which had been secured. The North German Confederation, including all the states except Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt, was immediately organized under the presidency of King William. To Prussia, an overwhelming superiority was secured, for the control of the federation was vested in a federal council in which, while each state possessed in theory equal voting power, she was allowed to exercise also the votes of those districts which she had recently incorporated. Nor was there any danger that the elective assembly, for which provision was also made, would hamper the executive. Its powers were duly limited, and it was unlikely ever to agree with the federal council. Thus the North German Confederation, dominated by Prussia and irrevocably united with her, was a valuable agent for the completion of German unity. Still, Germany was not yet united. The southern states, expressly excluded from the new league, were by no means anxious to submit to Prussian leadership, and the enemies of German unity even trusted that they would form an alliance in opposition to the North German Confederation. Such indeed had been the expectation of Napoleon III, when he insisted that the Main should form a dividing line. He believed that in this way he had forever postponed the completion of Bismarck's work, and even prepared for the substitution of France for Austria as guardian of centrifugal tendencies in Germany. That his expectation was falsified and his belief proved vain was the result of the ingenuity of the Prussian Chancellor and the dire necessity of the southern states. Immediately after the end of the war, realizing that they could not stand alone, they had concluded secret military conventions with the court of Berlin, which placed their forces as much at the disposal of William as the army of Saxony. And this step towards eventual union was soon followed by another. Appreciating the value of commercial ties, and that to accustom the South to joint action with the North would assuredly advance his cause, Bismarck suddenly denounced the Zollverein and refused to allow the southern states to re-enter it, except on his own terms. Threatened with economic ruin, the four governments gave way and assented to the creation of a general tariff parliament, and thus abandoned much of their aloofness of attitude. Union, in fact, was within sight. Yet Bismarck knew that union was still far from accomplished. Though the southern states had conceded some part of their independence, they had only done so under compulsion. They were not the less hostile to Prussia because their hostile feelings had to be concealed. They were not less desirous of preserving their aloofness because their aloofness was threatened. And even if they had been inspired with a lively desire for union under Prussian leadership, their separate existence would still have been the care of Napoleon III, who was ready to take up arms in order to undo that which he had so unwisely assisted to do. There were thus two requisites for the final completion of Bismarck's work. It was essential to create in the South a sense of its ultimate identity with the North, and it was essential to overthrow the Emperor of the French. And the Chancellor conceived that he could best secure both these requisites by a war with France, which, necessary for the destruction of Napoleon III, appeared also to offer the readiest means of rousing in Germany so vigorous a sentiment of unity that the antipathy of the southern states for Prussia might vanish away. In the years following the Peace of Prague, Bismarck devoted all his energy to the production of a situation which might enable King William to appear as the champion of German nationality against French aggression. And his greatest helper was his destined victim. Napoleon III was perhaps conscious of all his limitations save one. Having gained an imperial crown by cunning and absolute power by subtle deception, he believed himself to be the veritable embodiment of successful fraud, and so immune from all danger of being defrauded. Convinced that he could deceive all men, he never dreamed that he might be deceived. Hypocritical to the core, he was unsuspicious of hypocrisy in others, and so he fell an easy prey to the beguiling arts of one who was clear-sighted enough to pierce the heroic mist that concealed the comic actor, and skillful enough to offer convincingly the homage of forced sincerity. In dealing with the Emperor of the French, Bismarck seemed to confess that he had met his superior in craft, that all pretense was useless, that honesty was the best policy because dishonesty could not deceive. And such flattery, the deference of a great rogue for a greater, blinded the eyes of Napoleon III, so that he allowed himself to be guided like a child along the winding road to Sedan. By easy stages he was led to offend every power in Europe, to trample upon every susceptibility, to arouse every antagonistic feeling, and all the while he believed that he was shaping the future of the continent and playing to perfection the glorious part of man of destiny. Only at the 11th hour was the veil torn from his eyes. Only then did he behold himself as he was, divested of his fair cloak of deceit, standing before France and Europe, a discredited and friendless charlatan. End of section 21. Section 22 of From Metternich to Bismarck by Lionel Cecil Jane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9, The Fall of France, Part 1. The very brilliance of that part which the Emperor of France had undertaken to play almost ensured the eventual detection of his charlatanism. As man of destiny, he was compelled to stand constantly in the full glare of French and of European criticism, nor could it be expected that the eyes of his critics would be forever dazzled by the flashlight radiance of the coup d'etat and of the Congress of Paris, that those eyes would never penetrate the mask of Napoleonic paint and powder under which the true features of the actor were concealed. And when once that mask had been pierced, the day of successful play-acting was over. With the discovery of the true character of its creator, the very basis of the imperial system was destroyed. For, resting apparently on the army, the church, and the commercial class, seemingly owing its success to the favor of these adherents and to the dull indifference of the rural population, the Second Empire was in truth founded upon deceit and maintained by fraud. Its friends were attached to it less by sincere affection than by a lively hope that from it they would win the accomplishment of their dearest wishes, a hope created and fostered by the Emperor, who canvassed wildly the support of all, and even of divergent interests. Naturally prone to wide generalizations, he conferred upon the more attractive of his broad assertions the epithet Napoleonic, and alike in his voluminous writings and in his innumerable public speeches he explained that the empire meant everything delightful, from national glory to bulging pocketbooks, from peace to plenty. And as these generalizations were indeed wide, and from their width gained no small measure of obscurity, the empire meant all things to all men. To the army it implied a return of the glorious days of the first Napoleon. To the church, an almost ultramontane government. To the commercial class, unlimited opportunities for rapid money-making. To the people at large, the eventual dawning of the long-delayed era of universal content. Having sighed for 18 years under the shadow of the respectable Orleanist umbrella, France revelled in the possession of a ruler who might be trusted to outrage the susceptibilities of politically pious Metternichs, and yet, a veritable enigma, might be trusted also never to say or to do that which was expected of him. Thus, as long as the empire thrilled, it succeeded. When its novelty wore off, when it ceased to thrill, it failed. The generalizations which had made deception possible were no longer received with the needful unfaltering faith. Doubts arose, questions were asked. And more especially, the validity of Napoleon's claim to embody democracy was contested. It was pointed out that if this claim were just, then democracy was a term sadly in need of redefinition. For the whole internal system of the Second Empire was the very negation of popular government. The Chamber, hardly a representative body, might not initiate legislation. Its control over finance was largely illusory, since the budget was voted by departments and not in detail. The executive might transfer sums from one ministry to another, and the emperor, possessing the power of concluding commercial treaties, was able to modify the tariff by prerogative. The press, hampered by the necessity of authorization, was further crushed by the right of prefects of police to warn newspapers which showed signs of not admiring the existing order, and to suspend any twice-warned publication. Education, equally controlled by the government, was carefully restricted to non-political subjects, and the emperor hoped that a race of clean-shaven professors of language and science, having shed their disturbing theories with their moustaches, might keep in the spirit, as well as in the letter, the oath of allegiance which they were obliged to take. Nor was individual liberty sacred. Advantage was taken of Orsini's attempt to produce the General Security Act 1858, which permitted the imprisonment or transportation without trial of those suspect to the government, and which, as administered by Espinasse, was used to terrorize the people by the summary banishment of a reasonable percentage of the population in each department. Yet this system, autocratic as it was, did not at first excite resistance, partly because it was accompanied by a most satisfying development of material wealth, partly because such opposition as there was wanted unity, leadership, and tact. The monarchists, divided into Legitimists and Orleanists, dissipated their strength by internecine disputes. The politically wise programme of the Fusionists, who aimed at the alliance of the two branches of the Bourbon house, was rejected through the obstinacy of the claimants and the determination of Thiers, and the supporters of the younger line, who were better equipped for an attack, neutralized their advantages by frank advocacy of aristocratic franchise. And the Republicans were not in much better plight. Their leaders had been exiled, their newspapers were insignificant, their financial resources small. Their frequent plots, which were easily discovered by the imperial agents, rather benefited the government by keeping alive in the minds of the bourgeoisie a terror of anarchy and pillage. The weakness of the opposition was illustrated by the results of the first general election under the Empire. The original chamber was returned almost en bloc, and the Republican cause was represented only by the 5 deputies, among whom Jules Favre and Olivier were the most important. Nor was the tranquillity of the country greatly interrupted by the Republican outbreak at Angers, or by the half-dozen attempts on the life of the Emperor. The real events of the first 11 years of the reign were industrial and commercial. Material advance was assisted by the formation of the Crédit Foncier to facilitate the securing of capital for agriculture, by the development of railways and of steamship lines, and by the public works of Napoleon, whose enthusiasm for building was not always misdirected by his architect, Viollet-le-Duc, to the faulty restoration of medieval fortresses. The progress made was strikingly illustrated by the Great Paris Exhibition of 1855, evidence of the prevailing peace. Indeed, if absence of history constitutes the happiness of a nation, then during this period France was in a state of almost perfect bliss. Such political stagnation was for a while counterbalanced by the vigorous foreign policy of the Emperor, which excited the interest and distracted the attention of his subjects. But when an epidemic of cholera was followed by widespread floods and other national calamities, the masses, after their wont, sought for the political cause of such material disasters, and their rising discontent was peculiarly unfortunate, since it coincided with the alienation from the Empire of its earlier friends. Napoleon III succeeded in offending both the church and the commercial classes, and in his isolation was led to turn to the liberals, hoping that he might convince them of his sincere love for democracy and rally them to the defense of autocracy in the name of liberty. This hope proved vain, and consequently the loss of its first friends was fatal to the imperial system. Napoleon, in fact, fell a victim to the rash inconsistency of his professions. He perished in a futile attempt to reconcile ultramontanism and nationalism, cosmopolitanism and protection, an attempt which only involved him in a contest with the forces both of reaction and reform. It was with the forces of reaction that the Emperor first came into conflict. He was offended by the refusal of Pius IX to pass the Alps and to dignify the imperial coronation by his presence and benediction, and he retorted by giving but a cool reception to the newly promulgated doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. The quarrel thus begun was embittered by the French-Sardinian alliance and the Austrian War. It reached the stage of open rupture when, by the Treaty of Turin in 1860, the Emperor received Savoy and Nice, and in effect recognized the new kingdom of Italy. It was in vain that Napoleon strove to conciliate clerical opposition by piously supporting a federation of the peninsula under the Pope, and by defending the relics of the temporal power from the sacrilegious hands of Cavour and Garibaldi. It was in vain that he suppressed the chief Catholic newspaper. The government was attacked in the Senate, and the Emperor, distracted by the counter-arguments of the clericalist Empress Eugénie and his anti-clerical cousin, Prince Napoleon, could find no better defense than the most violent oscillation between two mutually destructive policies. He had signally failed in his effort to gratify at once the ultramontane party in the Church and the friends of Italian unity. He had rather angered both by his consistent inconsistency. Nor was he more fortunate in his attempt to combine those cosmopolitan theories which he had set forth so eloquently in his statement of the Napoleonic theory with the interests or supposed interests of his commercial friends. the manufacturers stoutly opposed the free trade doctrines which the emperor preached, and for a while Napoleon was compelled to bow to a storm of protest. But he reverted to the same idea when the exigencies of the Italian situation made an alliance with the English friends of Italy advisable. He used his treaty-making prerogative to conclude a commercial agreement with England in 1860, and thus took a definitive step in the direction of free trade. Forthwith, the manufacturers rose in opposition. The emperor was roundly denounced as the betrayer of his country, and as the treaty had been made without consulting the Chambers, the hostility to the imperial economist presently merged in a general attack on his whole political system. The attack was directly assisted by the emperor's own conduct. Deserted by his former allies and having special need for support in his quarrel with the Church, he granted an amnesty to the exiled liberals, hoping that they would be won over to his side by his Italian policy. But he merely supplied the opposition with efficient leadership, nor was this error repaired by the commission of a second blunder. The emperor became alarmed at the prominence which he had deliberately sought and gained. Fear of responsibility seized upon his soul, and the man of destiny shuddered at the sudden realization of the magnitude of his part. And thus he sought relief, sought to share with someone the onerous burden which he had assumed so lightly. He desired to throw some of the responsibility, or rather all the blame, for failure, if failure there was to be, on the representatives of the people. By an imperial decree in 1860, he announced that in future free discussion of an address to the throne should be allowed, and that ministers without other duties should be charged with the task of answering criticism and of defending the policy of the executive. He trusted that the Chamber, always remaining subservient, would never embarrass the government, and at the same time that he would be able to fortify himself against attack by alleging the expressed approval of the deputies. As far as the actual Chamber was concerned, his calculations proved tolerably accurate. In the divisions of that body, the Republican opposition, still confined to the Five, could exercise no real influence, and at first sight more was to be feared from the clericalist and commercial parties. The former remained bitterly hostile despite the continued occupation of Rome by French troops, the breach of the Entente with Victor Emmanuel after the affair of Aspromonte, and the appointment of Drouin de Lhuys, a known sympathizer with the Pope, as foreign minister. The commercialists complained with justice of the disordered state of the finances. Expenditure and taxation were increasing. The deficit was perpetual. So serious was the situation revealed by Fould in a memorandum to the emperor, that Napoleon was sufficiently alarmed to make his mentor Minister of Finance, and resigning the right of transfer, to agree to the production of a genuine budget. But these concessions gave little satisfaction, since they were coupled with reservations which destroyed much of their value, and the opposition in the Chambers did not cease. That opposition, however, though it irritated and embarrassed, hardly threatened the continued existence of the empire, which appeared to be no less safe than it had been 10 years before. It was the growth of resistance outside the Chamber which prepared the way for the downfall of the autocratic system, and so for the eventual destruction of Napoleon III. And the growth of this resistance was the direct result of that increased freedom of debate which was now permitted, and which led to a revival of popular interest in political questions. The fiery eloquence of Favre, the more studied criticism of Olivier, could not influence a single deputy to vote against the government. The Chamber was far too effectually corrupted for convictions to have any weight in it. But the Five educated opinion even among the representatives of the people, and their definite program of reform, urged in season and out of season, attracted attention and rapidly gained adherents in the country at large. The Republican demands were studiously moderate. They asked for little more than that the spirit of the Constitution should be observed by the abandonment of official candidature, the repeal of the General Security Act, the establishment of responsibility of ministers, and of the control of the Chamber over finance. Even their supplementary requests for the rights of public meeting and free association could hardly be considered outrageous by a professedly democratic emperor. Yet if Napoleon III had been a more acute political observer, he would have realized that the very moderation of his most deadly foes made their enmity doubly serious, for it rendered useless the cry, "Beware of the Red Republic," upon which he relied to save himself. The gentle revolutionaries of the Second Empire roared so softly that they did not even inspire fear in the timorous breasts of the clericals and bourgeoisie. On the contrary, the second general election found the opposition united as far as liberalism and ultramontanism could unite. It found Thiers as the advocate of high protection and the temporal power. It found the monarchists, their old attitude of passive resistance abandoned, actively joining in the attack on the empire. And the result of the attack was highly favorable to the attacking forces. The numbers of the opposition rose to 35, and most significant of all, 17 Republicans were elected, and Paris declared against Napoleon III. From this moment, the fall of absolutism was assured, and since an erring man of destiny seemed to be almost a contradiction, the play acting was well nigh finished. It was not perhaps because he realized that to admit a mistake would be fatal to his bubble reputation that the emperor ignored such signs of approaching change. Rather, his conduct in the next 6 years seems to show that he had come near convincing himself of his own greatness, and at the same time lost such decision of character as he had once possessed. Faced with two possible alternatives, open resistance and frank concession, he declined to adopt either. He made mild attempts to regain the lost affection of the clericals. He made tentative advances in all insincerity to the liberals, and strove thus to deceive them into agreement with the maintenance of autocracy. His efforts were futile and only served to increase the hostility of both parties in the opposition. As a matter of fact, Napoleon's cloak was threadbare, but its wearer only drew it more tightly to him, never realizing that so its gaping seams displayed his nakedness the more clearly. The day for successful lying had passed. Unsuccessful lying only aggravated the evils of a situation in which truth had become the only feasible policy. But of frankness the emperor was utterly incapable. Deceit had become an integral part of his nature. His constitutional preference for tortuous paths and opportunist counsels had been rather confirmed than corrected by advancing years, and this love of indecision led him to meet the crisis produced by the election by refusing to face it. He adopted first one policy and then another, and so discredited himself and alienated his friends, without conciliating a single convinced opponent. To cope with the increased strength of the opposition, he appointed a single chief minister to defend the government in the chamber. Rouher, who presently received this office, was a known supporter of the existing regime, and his name seemed a sufficient guarantee against concession or reform. But as though resolved to prove that upon his leadership no reliance could be placed, Napoleon followed up this apparent declaration in favour of resistance by making advances to the opposition. When Thiers exposed in moderate terms the utter disorganization of the state, the emperor answered by legalizing strikes. He then neutralized this concession by pronouncing against trade unions and declaring that parliamentary government, a more or less ingenious theory, was unsuited to practical conditions. At the same time, by concluding a convention with Victor Emmanuel for the withdrawal of the garrison from Rome, and by forbidding the publication of the syllabus in France, he widened the gulf between himself and the clericals. Nor was he able to accept a favorable opportunity for ending that isolation into which he was drifting. When Olivier, who had already so far succumbed to imperial blandishments as to abandon the Five, formed a new party of moderate progressives, advocating the combination of the dynasty and good order with increased liberty, Rouher was permitted to reply by a senatus consultum forbidding all discussion of the fundamentals of constitution. Thenceforth, all hope of voluntary reform passed away. The era of revolution was dawning. End of section 22. Section 23 of From Metternich to Bismarck by Lionel Cecil, Jane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9, The Fall of France, Part 2. For political discontent was no longer the monopoly of the deputies and the educated classes. Socialism, almost extinct since the days of the national workshops, revived as the unreality of the hopes formed of the empire appeared. The masses began to organize, and their organization and resistance were invigorated by the growth of a literary opposition. Napoleon, prematurely aged and stricken with illness, suddenly realized that his popularity was gone and that the throne of his son was in danger. Making one more supreme effort to deceive, in 1867 he issued a decree allowing the Chamber to question ministers on their conduct, and explained that the right of public meeting and liberty of the press was about to be established. But at the same time, the doctrine of responsibility of ministers was denied, and Rouher retained power. The projected reforms were not made, and the nation was merely angered by such palpable insincerity. Nor did the alacrity with which Napoleon hastened to defend Rome, again threatened by Garibaldi, improve the situation at home. The clerical opposition continued, and the Republicans, encouraged by the vigorous pen of Rochefort, now openly declared their hostility to the empire. The agitation culminated in the second general election, a reverse not merely for the ministers, but for the whole Napoleonic system. Such moderate liberals as Olivier were rejected. 40 avowed enemies of the empire were returned. 116 deputies supported a demand for real parliamentary government. Napoleon, disheartened and self-distrustful, felt that it was hopeless to resist further. A senatus consultum granted initiative in legislation to the Chamber, established a proper budget, and recognized responsibility of ministers. It was soon evident that these concessions were also hopeless. They came too late, since no one desired a reformed empire. Absolutism had its friends, a republic had more friends. No one loved the safe counsels of moderation. Paris answered the advances of the emperor by electing his personal enemy Rochefort. Incipient revolution everywhere prevailed, and even the selection of Olivier as minister did not calm the growing unrest. For the part of man of destiny was played out. France had ceased to trust the embodiment of democracy, and the liberal empire was recognized for what it was, a mere makeshift to enable the forces of reaction to rally. Discredited at home, Napoleon saw that he had one last chance of saving his dynasty. By a brilliant stroke in foreign policy, he might yet bring back the halcyon days of successful deception. In no other way could he do so. But the foreign policy of the Second Empire was based upon fraud no less than its internal system. That fraud had been equally detected, and thus success was no longer possible. Aided by almost incredible good fortune, Napoleon III had been able to play a part in continental politics altogether disproportionate, either to his own diplomatic skill or to the real strength of France. He had appeared as the humiliator of Russia, the arbiter of Europe, the liberator of Italy, the savior of the Pope. For a moment he had seemed almost comparable to his uncle. Yet his very success was fatal to him. He had done so much in so short a space of time that France had been thrilled and Europe astonished, and he was left to discover means for repeating the thrills and increasing the astonishment. But he found none. When Italy had been united and a limit set upon her unity, no obvious task remained for performance. There were no more oppressed nations to deliver, or if there were, their deliverance was too dangerous an occupation even for a man of destiny. As it was, his Italian policy had almost involved him in war with Prussia. If he were to continue the remodeling of Europe, it was clear that he must be prepared to meet a possible coalition against French aggression. And since he did not feel equal to this, he was led to adopt half measures and wild projects which ended in the ruin of his reputation and the exposure of his weakness. Indeed, the decline of his reputation dated almost from the very hour on which it reached its culminating point at Solferino. The truce of Villafranca was a confession of failure. The hesitancy of his later Italian policy raised doubts as to the stability of his character and the skill of his diplomacy. And an attempt to find in the New World those opportunities for brilliant action which were denied him in the Old ended in even more obvious disaster. The Republic of Mexico had been the scene of one of those periodical civil wars in which Latin America delights. Juarez, who had restored order and assumed a dictatorship, had become involved in a dispute with Great Britain, France, and Spain, and the combined fleets of the three powers had blockaded the Mexican coast in order to enforce their claims. But Napoleon III conceived that he might gain an easy triumph by separating himself from his allies and by adopting the cause of the domestic enemies of Juarez. He was encouraged in this view by the prayers of the Catholic party, offended by the church policy of the dictator, and by the outbreak of civil war in the United States, which seemed to preclude all possibility of an assertion of the Monroe Doctrine. In 1864, France therefore recognized the Archduke Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico. An army was sent to support him, and a momentary success was gained. But no sooner had the American Civil War ended than the government of Washington bluntly demanded the withdrawal of the French forces. Napoleon, unable to make war on the United States, gave way with some precipitancy, and the unfortunate Maximilian, abandoned to his fate, but refusing to abandon his friends, was captured and shot by the supporters of Juarez, 1867. In place of winning glory, the Emperor of the French had covered himself with shame and dishonor. And meanwhile in Europe, his prestige had been seriously impaired. The hopes of Poland had been revived and disappointed by the mingled leniency and severity of Alexander II. An attempt to quell the resultant discontent by drafting the disaffected into the army led to a useless rebellion, and Napoleon III believed that he had found another oppressed people whom he might deliver. But the other powers were less sympathetic. Prussia, having Polish subjects of her own and needing Russian friendship, concluded a military convention with the oppressor. Austria was content to explain her Platonic disapproval of the Tsar. Great Britain, protesting more vigorously, none the less declined to agree to the French suggestion of a Congress to settle the question, and thus Napoleon, who had attacked Russia in unmeasured terms, was left either to enter upon war single-handed or to allow his protestations of righteous anger to remain mere protestations. He chose the latter course, and so succeeded in irritating Alexander by his original violence disgusting the Poles by his present inaction and reducing his prestige by his inconsistency. Indeed, when he was brought into conflict with the man who was destined to lure him to destruction, the Emperor of the French had already ceased to inspire either fear or respect. Europe was no longer blind to the imperfections of the imperial actor, and least of all was Bismarck impressed by the air of mysterious power which that actor assumed. While ambassador in Paris, the Prussian chancellor had taken the measure of his rival. He had found means by which to deceive the arch-deceiver. In conversations with Bismarck, Napoleon had suggested that Prussia should assist him to secure a rectification of the French frontier. The polite attention of the ambassador was taken to mean assent, and the whole foreign policy of France was henceforth dictated by a fatuous belief in Prussian friendship. It was this belief that led Napoleon tamely to acquiesce in the coercion of Denmark. It was the same belief which enabled Bismarck at Biarritz to secure French neutrality and the Italian alliance. Nor did the Emperor realize his error until Austria had fallen and the unification of Germany been rendered inevitable, until his neutrality had lost its value, and until he had fatally compromised his position towards the South German states. On the eve of war, he had asked for his reward. His request had not been definitely answered, but neutrality was now the only possible policy, and he made a virtue of necessity, announcing his unalterable love for peace. Perhaps Napoleon hoped that the coming struggle would be prolonged, and that he would be able to intervene with decisive effect. If so, all his calculations were roughly upset by the Battle of Königsgrätz. Nor did the request for his mediation compensate him for his failure to secure any material advantage. It was indeed the occasion for fresh deception. Because Bismarck hinted vaguely that the time had now come for France to gain something somewhere, Napoleon agreed to the Prussian annexations in northern Germany and to the formation of the North German Confederation. Even when Bismarck had shown his disregard for French interests by publishing the negotiations between the courts of Paris and Berlin, and making known the fact that Napoleon had demanded the cession of the Bavarian Palatinate, the Emperor still continued to pin his faith on the vaguest professions of goodwill and to ignore the damning evidence of facts. For the next 12 months, therefore, Napoleon continued his frantic endeavours to secure some kind of reward for his neutrality during the 7 Weeks' War, and to disprove Thiers' assertion that he had been fatally outwitted. In rapid succession, demands were put forward for compensation on the Rhine, in Belgium, in Luxembourg. In each case, Bismarck answered by an almost papal non possumus, and only in the case of the last named district did Napoleon's efforts even appear likely to succeed. The King of Holland agreed to hand over his rights to the Grand Duchy. But Luxembourg was part of the old Germanic Confederation. The Parliament of the North German Confederation was furiously indignant at the idea of its absorption by France, and Bismarck was able to express his deep regret that he could not run counter to the wishes of his allies. Immediately afterwards, the Powers put an end to all thoughts of French expansion in this particular direction by the Treaty of London, May 1867, which neutralized the district and placed its independence under the guarantee of Europe. On all sides, Napoleon III had failed, and he was no longer permitted to doubt that he had been hopelessly deceived. It only remained to seek revenge, to attempt to undo that which had been done, and to prevent, even at the 11th hour, the completion of German unity. And as this could only be done by war with Prussia was now inevitable. But Napoleon was only too well aware that his strength was unequal to such a contest, and all his efforts were therefore directed to secure an alliance. And here he suffered the nemesis of deceit. Posing as the political heir of the great Napoleon, he had not hesitated to trample on the prejudices of all Europe. He had boldly attacked Russia in the Crimea, and offended her by his Polish policy. He had opposed Austria in Italy, and denied to Italy her capital. And he had won no friendship to counterbalance such hostility. For a moment, indeed, it seemed that Beust might be ready to support him. But the Austrian monarchy was now a dual state, and the Hungarian minister Andrassy was reluctant to do anything to restore that German connection which had been the greatest obstacle to the realization of Magyar hopes. A vigorous correspondence between Napoleon III and Francis Joseph only produced a vague understanding. Nor, when he turned to Italy, did the French emperor meet with better success. That power had been alienated by the French occupation of Rome. Her alienation was intensified when, after a new attempt by Garibaldi to give Italy her capital had been defeated at Mentana, Rouher openly declared that France would never permit the complete destruction of the temporal power. And as Russia was allied with Prussia, and as Great Britain would not stir, France was left isolated in Europe. It was possibly a sense of this isolation which led Napoleon to stake everything on one desperate throw, and to hasten the crisis which was to prove fatal to him. The immediate occasion was afforded by the raising of the question of the Spanish succession. Isabella II had been driven from her throne by Prim, and a republic had been proclaimed. But that form of government proved unpopular. The Spanish people desired a king, and among the number of the candidates who appeared was Leopold, a cadet of the Hohenzollern house. France had already raised objections to his candidature, and when he was elected, Napoleon announced that his accession would be regarded as a casus belli. Leopold, by his own accord, retired. The emperor was able to congratulate himself on having at last secured a diplomatic triumph, and the incident appeared to be closed. But Napoleon was not content with the success which he had won. Benedetti, the French ambassador at Berlin, was instructed to demand a guarantee that the candidature would not be renewed. King William answered that the actions of Leopold had not been and would not be dictated by Prussia, and when he was pressed for a more definite reply, he sent a message to the ambassador to the effect that he had said his last word. This news was telegraphed from Ems to Bismarck at Berlin. The Chancellor deliberately published the telegram in a somewhat abbreviated form. The German press announced that the king had insulted the ambassador. And since feeling ran high in both countries, Paris believed that William had publicly turned his back on Benedetti. Excitement rose to fever pitch, and after a council which lasted far into the night, Napoleon III decided on war, July 14th, 1870. It would appear that he did so against his own better judgment, and that he was overcome by the passionate entreaties of Eugenie, who trembled for her son's throne if the lost popularity of her husband was not regained, and by the blind optimism of his advisers. Grandmont, Minister of Foreign Affairs, was confident that Austria would hasten to avenge Königsgrätz, and that Italy would not forget Solferino. He did not realize that the dual monarchy was menaced by Russia, or that the liberated peninsula remembered Villafranca and Mentana. The two powers were, it is true, gently sympathetic. They would readily have shared in a French triumph, but they would not risk sharing in a French defeat. And if Grandmont's optimism was rash, that of Leboeuf, Minister of War, was criminal. Forgetting that the army was ill-armed, ill-equipped, ill-organized, and without communications or any other requisites for rapid mobilization, he fancied that Prussia would be as dilatory as Austria, and placed all his hope in a sudden attack which should paralyze German resistance and unite the southern states in support of a welcome invader. The futility of such roseate dreams soon appeared. Bismarck afterwards claimed that he had selected the very hour for the declaration of war, and however that may be, certainly Prussia was fully prepared. Her armies, reinforced by those of all Germany, advanced according to a carefully thought-out plan. The French, scattered in weak divisions without any real leadership, were attacked and overthrown in detail, and within a month of the first engagement, the issue of the war had been decided. Crossing the frontier at 3 points, the invaders gained their initial success at Weissenburg, where the vanguard of MacMahon's army was driven back, and 2 days later the tardily proposed concentration of the French forces was prevented by the victories of Wörth and Spicheren. While MacMahon with one army fell back upon Châlons and the line of the Marne, Bazaine with the second retreated upon Metz, and the Emperor, who had taken the field in person, seemed incapable of deciding upon any sort of plan. Even when he handed over the supreme command to Bazaine, matters did not improve. The Marshal determined on joining hands with MacMahon, but it was now too late, since the Germans had already thrown themselves between the two armies. Successive defeats at Vionville, Marlatour, and Gravelotte compelled the French to take refuge under the guns of Metz, where they were presently blockaded by Prince Frederick Charles. A fortnight later, the crowning disaster occurred. Napoleon, forced to remain at the front by his wife, and practically allowing her to direct the campaign from Paris, overrode the wishes of MacMahon and ordered him to relieve Metz. But he was checked at Beaumont and caught by the Prussians at Sedan. Almost surrounded and subject to a furious cannonade, the bravery of the French was vain, and the Emperor, never well able to bear the sight of bloodshed, begged for an armistice. Bismarck and Moltke insisted upon unconditional surrender. 83,000 soldiers became prisoners of war, and Napoleon himself passed into captivity. The army of Bazaine was left to represent the military strength of France. And Sedan was decisive of the fate of the Second Empire. The first defeats had been followed by the fall of the ministry. This last reverse led to a revolution. When the news reached Paris, the mob attacked the chamber, the deputies were compelled to abandon the executive, and the Empress, laying down the regency, fled to England. A provisional government headed by Trochu, governor of Paris, Jules Favre, and Gambetta was created. The example of the capital was anticipated rather than followed in the provinces. Everywhere the Republic was proclaimed. It was charged with the sacred duty of freeing French soil from the invaders, and its optimistic leaders thoroughly believed that the glories of the Convention were about to be repeated. Favre announced to Bismarck that not an inch of territory would be ceded, and while the Prussians advanced upon Paris, preparations were made not merely for the defence of the capital, but also for the organization of national resistance. It seemed almost a degradation that Thiers should be allowed to depart on a diplomatic begging tour round the courts of Europe. Foreign assistance seemed unnecessary. A republic alone was needed to hurl back the invaders. But all this optimism was rendered vain by two facts. The sentiment of nationalism which had inspired the victors of Jemappes and Valmy now inspired the victors of Gravelotte and Sedan, and the sterilizing influence of political stagnation had made itself felt in France. The invigorating influence of newfound political life had roused the enthusiasm of Germany. It is possible that a really national resistance might have yet turned the fortune of war, but it was impossible that such resistance should be made. And its impossibility was soon illustrated. While Gambetta, escaping from the blockaded capital, formed a second centre of government at Tours, and by his endless energy and determination called new armies into being, Bazaine at Metz remained the passive spectator of his country's ruin. He had apparently hoped that the overthrow of Napoleon III would leave him master of the situation, and he now attempted to play the part which Monk had played in England. Instead of making some real effort to harass the enemy, instead of making an effort to cut his way through to Paris, instead even of devoting all his attention to prolonging the siege of Metz, he entered into communications with Bismarck and strove to secure for himself permission to restore order in France. The result was as might have been anticipated. After 2 months of fruitless negotiations, Bazaine found that his supplies were running short. A final effort to secure lenient terms from the Prussians failed. He and his whole army of 173,000 men surrendered unconditionally, and while Prince Frederick Charles was enabled to join in the attack on Paris, the last regular French army disappeared. In such circumstances, the heroic defence of Strasbourg and Belfort and all the efforts of Gambetta were alike fruitless. The recovery of Orléans and a victory at Coulmières availed nothing. A month later, the tide of success turned definitely in favour of the invaders. Orléans was retaken. Attempted joint operations between the garrison of Paris and the army without the walls were defeated. The north of France was reduced by the victories of Amiens and Saint-Quentin. The provisional government was forced to retire to Bordeaux. The fall of Paris was now inevitable, and after a siege of 130 days, famine compelled surrender. January 28, 1871. With that surrender, the war ended. Preliminaries of peace were arranged between Bismarck and Thiers at Versailles, and despite the opposition of Gambetta, a National Assembly accepted the terms offered. By the Peace of Frankfurt, France ceded Alsace, with the exception of Belfort, and German Lorraine to Prussia, or rather to the newly formed German Empire. Paris was occupied for 2 days, and an indemnity of 5 milliards of francs was exacted. But it is not in the actual terms of peace that the significance of the Franco-German War is to be found. It lies rather in the fact that through it the work begun in the War of Liberation, continued in the anti-Parliament and at Königsgrätz, reached its final consummation. 10 days before the capitulation of Paris, and in the Great Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the King of Prussia accepted that crown which his brother had declined. The German Empire was proclaimed, and the unity which had been so long desired was apparently attained with the hearty assent of all the princes of Germany. And though the cordiality of that assent has possibly been exaggerated, though Bavaria was still reluctant, and though the southern states would not surrender all their cherished independence, none the less the triumph of Bismarck was almost complete. Attempts have been made to draw an instructive moral lesson from this triumph. It has been alleged that the victory of Germany was the victory of manliness and virtue over decadence and vice, and Bismarck has been pictured as a God-fearing hero reaping the just reward of the righteous. God-fearing he no doubt was, but he never allowed his fear of God to hamper him in political life, nor did any considerations of conscience prevent him from uttering diplomatic lies. In point of honesty, there is little to choose between Napoleon III and Bismarck. The advantage of the latter lay not in his greater regard for truth, but in the more cautious nature of his lying. The Emperor of the French had attempted to deceive on too great a scale. The very magnificence of his conception of the possibilities latent in fraud produced his failure. The Prussian Chancellor was a less soaring exponent of the deceptive art, and his humility gained its reward. Napoleon III had aimed at ruling a continent by play-acting, and the audience had hissed him off the stage. Bismarck was content to appear as the founder of a mere empire, and by playing that part successfully, he won for himself the plaudits of that very audience which the man of destiny had failed to convince. End of section 23. Section 24 of From Metternich to Bismarck by Lionel Cecil Jane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10, The Bismarck System, Part 1. Creator of a new empire, restorer of unity to a long-divided race, conqueror of his country's hated foe, Bismarck appeared well to merit all the plaudits, all the honours showered upon him, to have gained a triumph such as it has fallen to the lot of but few men to secure. Yet neither was he content, nor did he taste the gladness of perfect realization. The German Empire was founded, to all seeming, it was broad-based upon a people's will, welded together by the sacred fire of nationality, confirmed by sorrow and by joy, maintained by the blessed union of hearts that throbbed as one. Fair was the prospect, unclouded the brightness of the dawn, sure the hope of everlasting life. But it was not given to all to know with what reluctance King Ludwig of Bavaria had parted for ever with the secular dream of the house of Wittelsbach. How unwillingly he had given utterance to the wishes of his fellow princes, with what doubtings he had implored William to accept an imperial crown. Nor did there appear on the surface that rancour which lay deep-rooted in Bavarian and Saxon hearts, a rancour not the less permanent because momentarily forgotten in the fever of high emotion, because that forgetfulness had led to so untoward, so fatal a result. Minds filled with the glamour of the dramatic climax at Versailles found it impossible to understand how jealously the skeleton of local independence was guarded against the too fortunate Hohenzollerns. Ears deafened by paeans of victory could not hear the dull murmurings of ill-omened dissent, nor did the eyes of entranced beholders pierce the bright sunshine of success. But Bismarck's eyes were not dazzled, and the clearness of his political vision remained undimmed by the enthusiasm of that supreme moment. To eyewitnesses of the scene, he appeared to be uplifted by the wonder of ultimate triumph. Perhaps he was rather depressed by the conviction of the incompleteness of that triumph. For Germany was only partially united. The empire was only a federated state. King William had inclined to abdicate rather than agree to anything short of the complete triumph of Prussia. The Crown Prince had urged the forcible suppression of every vestige of local independence. But the masterful tact of the Chancellor had overborne the opposition of both father and son. He had seen how necessary it was to seize the golden hour while Germans were triumphing over Frenchmen. He did not forget the moral ascendancy of the Habsburgs, or that Vienna was more German than Berlin. An attempt to secure all might well involve the loss of that which could be gained, and the half-loaf of federation was better than utter denial of the bread of unity, peace, and concord. The German Empire was therefore and is a compromise. It is neither coextensive with the true fatherland, since millions of good Teutons on the Danube are excluded, nor is it a purely German paradise, since the Prussianization of Posen is not even now complete. It is neither a federation of free states, as was the old Bund, nor a centralized monarchy, such as William and probably Bismarck desired. The King of Prussia is German Emperor, not Emperor of Germany. He is in theory the president among the princes of the empire. Supreme in time of war, powerful in time of peace, he yet may not infringe those local rights which are guaranteed even to such petty states as Lippe Detmold. And though for ordinary purposes the Prussian vote carries the day in the Bundesrat, the Federal Council in which the individual members of the empire are represented, still no change can be made in the Constitution in face of the united opposition of the southern states. It is perhaps not unwise that the deliberations of this council are decently hidden from the gaze of the vulgar, that publicity is confined to the less vital debates of the Reichstag, a lower house elected by manhood suffrage, which may imagine, but imagines wrongly, that it governs the German Empire. If the disputes within the Bundesrat were equally public, it would possibly be more obvious than it is that the new unity of Germany is really maintained by the armed might of Prussia, and that the throbbing heart of the united German people is not immune from inharmonious palpitations. And if Bismarck did not attain full realization of his ideals at home, he was still more subjected to bitter disappointment abroad. Imagining that he had forever, or at least for a generation, crushed the power of France, and that he had laid the sure foundation of a long era of undisputed Teutonic supremacy by the overthrow of the leading Latin state, he was sadly undeceived by the wonderful recovery of his beaten foe. On the morrow of the capitulation of Paris, France seemed rapidly to be drifting towards a condition of utter anarchy. Within 5 years, the state had been reorganized upon a far securer basis than any which had been devised since the fall of the Ancien Régime. And with this reorganization, the prospects of German ascendancy were somewhat overclouded, the labours of Bismarck rendered less fruitful than he had hoped. Expecting the establishment of the Red Republic, which should be a splendid foil to the good order of the German Empire, the Chancellor found that the Republic established was no less white than the system which it had replaced. For the revolution produced by the overthrow of Napoleon and the calamities of the French arms ran the same course as the revolutions which had driven forth Charles X and Louis Philippe. Once again, sober politicians were content merely to change the name of the government. Once again, a more enthusiastic party aimed at a complete revolution. They, the Communards, wished to abandon that centralization which had hitherto prevailed. They hoped, by granting autonomy to the local communes, to establish the complete supremacy of the original Commune of Paris, reviving that ascendancy of the capital which had been enjoyed during the Revolution. Supported by mutinous soldiers and the National Guard, favoured by the masses, who desired as ever redress of material grievances, they were able to seize the Hôtel de Ville, drive Thiers, head of the state, and the government of the National Assembly, to Versailles, and acquire control of part of Paris. The red flag of the social revolution replaced the dull tricolour of milk and water republicanism. A revolutionary commune came into being, and a pale simulation of the glorious reign of terror was inaugurated. The regeneration of France was begun. Such regeneration had only reached the stage of massacre and licensed arson, which the Commune was powerless to prevent, when the forces of order, rallying at Versailles and laying siege to Paris, reasserted the authority of the National Assembly, April to May 1871. Paris was once more captured, the would-be remakers of society were condemned as society's foes, those taken with arms were shot as criminals, the rest were transported or imprisoned. Never had such vigour been displayed by a French executive, never such severity. The streets were red with blood, and in horror the second siege far surpassed the first. France has hardly yet forgotten the last effort of idealists and self-seekers to unite for the forcible creation of a pure regime. And in such horrors the Third Republic came to birth. The Bordeaux Assembly had early decreed the deposition of Napoleon III and the abolition of the Second Empire. A republican government had been formed provisionally, and Thiers had been elected head of the state. But it remained to elaborate a constitution, and here parties were sharply divided. The monarchists, possessing a majority, would have recalled a representative of the Bourbon house, but at first could not agree upon the representative to be recalled. The Republicans were not wholly satisfied with the validity of an assembly elected while France was occupied by Germans, and loving the Republic with unfeigned sincerity, by disputing upon this question, did their utmost to destroy that Republic. It was the work of Thiers to hold the balance between the two extremist parties, and gradually to form a moderate group prepared to bring back good order to the state. He succeeded in his task, though he did not himself place the coping stone upon the edifice of the new order. For a while, factious opposition kept France in a condition not unlike one of anarchy. The government was in theory only provisional, and to royalists and pure republicans alike it was of primary importance to delay all definition. But gradually it became clear, as Thiers, now elected president, pointed out, that the existing order could only be changed by revolution. Revolution was not desired by the moderates of either wing of the Assembly, and their coalition enabled the executive to stamp out disorder. France was freed from the presence of German troops by the prompt payment of the war indemnity. The army was reorganized on the system which had given victory to Prussia. The revenue was regulated and increased, and the National Guard, that historic storm centre, was abolished. Such reorganization brought its reward. Though Gambetta somewhat dimmed the great reputation won by his zeal in the cause of national defence, by conducting an equally energetic campaign in favour of sovereignty of the people, though the royalist sections intrigued for the return of the Comte de Chambord, Thiers was able to give his country more or less stable government, and to hold in check the latent forces of disorder. When, however, his efforts to induce the Assembly to vote a definitive constitution only resulted in a limitation of his own powers and the defeat of his ministers, he abandoned hope and resigned. 1873. The result of his resignation was to throw power into the hands of the monarchists, who had united in accepting the representative of the elder line, and who hoped by delay to bring about a restoration. They secured the election of MacMahon as president. The Marshal, as a soldier, felt himself in honour bound to forward the interests of those who had elected him, and the head of the state consistently supported those who planned his overthrow. Endless discussions on the form of the projected constitution wasted the time of the Assembly, and meanwhile every effort was made to dissipate the idea that France had in any wise committed herself to a republican form of government. But the royalists were too weak to force the issue. Many were alienated by the declaration of the Comte de Chambord against the tricolour. Signs of a Bonapartist revival alarmed all sections. The debate on the Constitution suddenly ceased. An amendment, formally recognizing that the head of the executive was President of the Republic, really ended the chances of a restoration, and it was speedily followed by the definitive establishment of that system which still maintains. Organized in close imitation of the Belgian Constitution, the Third Republic is governed by a president elected for 7 years by the two chambers, by responsible ministers, and by a Senate and Chamber of Deputies. Its general character is conservative, and to its conservatism, to the compromise which it embodies between monarchical and extreme republican ideas, its success has been due. At times its existence has been imperilled. Under MacMahon and since, it has trembled on the brink of a coup d'etat, but it has shown unexpected vitality, and has already existed longer than any form of government possessed by France since the Constituent Assembly of 1789 set the example of constitution mongering. And to Bismarck, such conservatism was most disheartening. He had roundly rebuked the German ambassador at Paris for showing sympathy with the Bonapartists. He desired nothing more than the very reddest of red republics across the Rhine. Such a government would alienate the monarchical powers. It would lend weight to his warnings of the dangers of socialism and of anarchy. And it was upon these warnings that he relied to enable him to escape a repetition of Tilsit, to prevent that union of Russia and France which was the persistent nightmare of the Cabinet of Berlin. To prevent such a coalition, which threatened to grind Germany to powder between an upper and nether millstone, was the Chancellor's most cherished aim. The eventual formation of such a coalition is the index of his relative failure in foreign politics. For a moment, however, despite the lamentable recovery of France, he secured a measure of success. Friends were forthcoming, and a league was formed recalling to mind the days of Troppau and Verona. Alexander II, as though haunted by some premonition of that nitroglycerin bomb which was eventually to bring his reign to so abrupt a conclusion, feared revolution with a deadly fear. And this fear, stimulated by the German Chancellor, served to strengthen those cordial relations which had subsisted between the courts of Petersburg and Berlin since the days of the Polish rebellion. Before the Tsar's blinking eyes, Bismarck conjured up gaunt spectres, red-handed socialism and blood-stained anarchy triumphant. To trembling prayers for advice, he answered by pointing out the one true way of salvation, by urging with insistence the need for a monarchical league to hold in check the prevalent tendency to disorder. And Alexander, hearing, remembered. At the same time, that reconciliation between Prussia and Austria, for which Bismarck's moderation after Königsgrätz had prepared, was completed. To the Magyars, the establishment of German unity under the Hohenzollerns had always appeared desirable. Nothing could more contribute to the attainment of their own ends. And now, when the acceptance of dualism and the ceremony at Versailles had forever relegated to the land of dreams all hope of a revived Habsburg ascendancy in Germany, the Austrians were won over to the Hungarian view. They realized that the dominant races in the dual monarchy were threatened by the Pan-Slav movement, and that the enemy to be feared was rather at Petersburg than at Berlin. The resultant change of feeling was indicated by the fall of the anti-Prussian Beust and by the accession to office of Andrassy, the leading exponent of the policy of a German alliance. A willing ear was thus lent to the friendly overtures of Bismarck, and a rapprochement between the two courts naturally ensued. The hostility of Austria being thus overcome, Bismarck was able to bring about a meeting of the three emperors at Berlin, 1872. And though neither this conference nor other similar conferences led to the conclusion of any definitive alliance, the three Eastern powers did reach a general understanding upon the principles which should govern their policy. They prepared to resist revolution in all its forms, concerting measures for the repression of unauthorized nationalist agitations and for the prevention of socialistic outbursts. The Prussian Chancellor was relieved from any immediate anxiety, and his feeling of security was increased by the practical adhesion of Italy to the so-called League of the Three Emperors. Victor Emmanuel, as a result of the fall of Napoleon III, had won his capital and the undying hatred of Pius IX. But that hatred had been almost equally incurred by Francis Joseph, who had adopted a liberal ecclesiastical policy which the Pope characterized as sane nefanda, and by Bismarck, who in the Kulturkampf, a controversy brought on by the promulgation of the dogma of papal infallibility, had favoured the dissident Catholics. The three courts were thus drawn together, and it seemed as if a new quadruple alliance was about to assume the direction of Central and Eastern Europe. But such harmony was not of long duration. The new league was soon shipwrecked upon the fatal Ottoman rock. For the manifold problems which constitute the Eastern question had in no sense been solved by the Crimean War and the Treaty of Paris. Rather, The vanity of the fancied settlement had been abundantly demonstrated. That union of Wallachia and Moldavia against which Great Britain had then laboured to provide had none the less been effected, and the Principality of Roumania been created. Alexander II, seizing the occasion of the Franco-German War, had denounced the Black Sea clauses of the treaty. And above all, the Porte had proved conclusively how empty were the promises of reform in which the Western powers had placed such touching confidence. Turks continued to oppress, Christians to revolt. Disturbances in Crete troubled the powers. A massacre in Lebanon produced French intervention. All things continued as they had been since the decay of the Ottoman Empire produced that fear which begets tyranny. Nor did the eternal question grow less acute as the years passed away. On the contrary, its difficulty was increased by the introduction of a new disturbing element. Encouraged by the Progressive Party in Russia and by the success of parallel movements in Italy and Germany, perhaps influenced also by the establishment of dualism across the Danube, the Slavs of the Balkan Peninsula, those scattered remnants of nations for which Bismarck cared so little, began to see visions and to dream dreams of union. They conceived that they might dominate southeastern Europe, and the consequent agitation speedily led to a storm. A bad harvest in Herzegovina supplied the immediate cause or excuse. The tax-gatherers refused to forego their dues. The taxpayers preferred death in battle to death by starvation. In 1875 a revolt began in this district and spread rapidly to Bosnia. Servia and Montenegro grew restless, and Europe was compelled once more to attempt the achievement of the impossible. End of section 24. Section 25 of From Metternich to Bismarck by Lionel Cecil, Jane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10, The Bismarck System, Part 2. And as had been the case during the War of Greek Independence, the first aim of the powers was to prevent isolated action by Russia. Bismarck, though he contemptuously asserted that the whole Eastern question was not worth the bones of a single Pomeranian grenadier, feared for the fate of that harmony which he had so laboriously produced. Andrassy had the true Austrian dread of nationalist manifestations and of Russian aggression, and both these statesmen therefore laboured to hold the Tsar true to his implied obligation only to act in concert with the courts of Berlin and Vienna. For a time their efforts were successful. Alexander II, hating Pan-Slavism as a type of revolution and constitutionally averse from war, was only concerned not to offend the sentiment of his people. He did not venture to ignore the tears of his co-religionists, but he hoped that he might profit from the errors of his uncle and of his father, that he might avoid the Scylla of unpopularity no less than the Charybdis of conflict with the other powers. Thus, when Andrassy produced a scheme of necessary reforms, the Tsar readily agreed to support his recommendations. England and France gave a less cordial assent, and the Andrassy note was duly presented to the Porte. But its influence was somewhat impaired by the fact that it did not assume a collective form, and though the Ottoman government accepted the advice with one reservation, nothing at all was done in the way of acting upon it. Indeed, so far from the question being settled, it entered almost immediately upon a more acute phase. For perhaps as a result of the Turkish victories in Bosnia, the unrest in Montenegro and Servia increased. Rebellion spread to Bulgaria, and the customary massacres assumed a more serious character when the Mohammedans murdered the German and French consuls at Saloniki. More decisive measures became necessary. the Eastern powers agreed upon the Berlin Memorandum, May 1876, to impose an armistice on the Porte, and to intervene if the grievances were not redressed within 2 months. But England declined to be a party to any course so hostile to the Ottoman government. She emphasized her disapproval by sending her fleet to Bezika Bay, and from this moment all chance of concerted action disappeared. The revolution at Constantinople, May through August 1876, intensified the difficulty of the situation. Abdul Aziz, weak and a conciliator of the powers, was deposed. His successor, Murad V, speedily returned to that obscurity from which he had half emerged. Abdul Hamid II began his eventful reign. But such events afforded a golden opportunity to the disaffected. Serbia and Montenegro declared war upon the Sultan. Their armies were recruited by Russian volunteers. And while the whole Balkan peninsula thus flamed into revolt, the intervention of Europe, or at least of the Tsar, could no longer be confined to the mere giving of unpalatable and unaccepted advice. Finding that in event of a conflict with Austria he could only count upon German hostility and not upon German gratitude, Alexander II resolved to act in union with Francis Joseph. The two emperors met and came to an agreement at Reichstadt, and though diplomatic efforts continued, the outbreak of war between Russia and Turkey was merely a question of time. And meanwhile the Turks did their best to alienate the sympathy of England. Alarmed at the general character of the risings, the Ottoman government determined to crush the unrest in Bulgaria before it reached a head. The methods adopted were more than usually barbarous, and although the Bulgarian atrocities, May 1876, may have been exaggerated, the sensation created was more than justified by the facts. It was in vain that Disraeli attempted to dismiss the reports as mere coffee-house babbling. England paid more attention to Gladstone, who used all the fiery eloquence of which he was master to denounce the pro-Turkish policy of the government. The result was seen in an offer of British mediation, and the mild suggestion that an ultimatum might some day follow its rejection. The Porte replied by its customary promise of reform. But the patience of Alexander was almost exhausted. A definite threat of war compelled the Sultan to suspend military operations, and while the Tsar, protesting his devotion to peace, strove to reassure English opinion, the labours of the diplomatists were increasingly hopeless. Their hopelessness was increased by the action of Disraeli, now Lord Beaconsfield. While inviting the powers to a conference at Constantinople for the discussion of the whole problem, he permitted himself to hint in rather unguarded language at the divergence of interest between England and Russia, and a bellicose speech at the Guildhall was at once effectually answered at Moscow. Alexander appealed to his subjects to give him the support necessary for the work of saving the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. He followed up this by ordering the mobilization of the army. In such circumstances, the Conference of Constantinople could but fail. Though a project of reform, supported by all the powers, was duly presented to the Porte, the latter paid more attention to assurances received from its ambassador in London. The growing rivalry between England and Russia was hailed with satisfaction by the Sultan, and in place of accepting the suggestions offered, Abdul Hamid sought to gain time by the startling announcement that he was about to grant a constitution on the most approved Western model to the whole Ottoman Empire. But such promises were disregarded. A further conference in London resulted in a collective note insisting upon immediate reform, and to this note was appended a Russian ultimatum. In vain the Porte assembled the first Turkish parliament and pathetically complained that the unsympathetic attitude of Europe would ruin its efforts to establish representative government. In vain it announced its noble resolve not to be content with that half liberty for Christians which was all that Europe desired. Alexander held to his course, and treating the Turkish answer as a rejection of his ultimatum, immediately declared war. April 1877. The other powers at once proclaimed that they would not interfere, though Great Britain added a stipulation that her interests must not be threatened by the occupation of Constantinople or by any infringement of the neutrality of Egypt. The occupation of Constantinople at first seemed to be well within the bounds of possibility. It appeared that Russia was about to enjoy that easy triumph which she has always been expected to secure in her contests with Turkey, and which she has always failed to win. Boldly ignoring the Ottoman army, which was posted in the strongholds north of the Balkans, and crossing the mountains by an unexpected route, Gurko turned the Shipka Pass and advanced into Roumelia. But the tide of success soon turned. With the arrival of Turkish reinforcements, the Russians were compelled to retreat, and at the same time Plevna, hastily entrenched by Osman Pasha, was the scene of heavy reverses for the imperial troops. During nearly 6 months the town withstood all attacks successfully. The whole strength of the Russian Empire was hurled in vain against one minor Bulgarian fortress. The Turks, however, failed to profit by their victories. Plevna at last fell, and the Shipka Pass being still in the hands of the invaders, the advance on Constantinople was immediately undertaken. At Philippopolis the Ottoman army was crushingly defeated. Adrianople was occupied, and the Porte, which had already sought European mediation, now treated for peace. Alexander II was not disinclined to end the war. The advance of his army towards the Turkish capital had troubled the English government. It is not impossible that if the Beaconsfield cabinet had been united in opinion, Great Britain would have actively intervened. Even as it was, Parliament was invited to make a special grant of money, and the speeches in which this request was supported showed that war with Russia was probable. Nor was the danger reduced by the terms of the Convention of Adrianople. The Russians were permitted to advance within sight of Constantinople. The British fleet passed the Dardanelles, and the situation became critical in the extreme. It was saved by the necessities of the Tsar and the determination of Andrassy. While Beaconsfield was almost openly provocative, the Hungarian statesmen insisted that the convention could not be allowed to form the basis of a definite peace, and proposed that a Congress should be assembled, and to this proposition Russia, unable to face a general war, agreed. Meanwhile, the Porte had been obliged to accept terms of peace well calculated to offend Europe. By the Treaty of San Stefano, the independence of Romania, Servia, and Montenegro was recognized. The two latter states were to receive an extension of territory. Bosnia and Herzegovina were to be autonomous, Crete to be administered, and Armenia to have special privileges. Certain fortresses were to be handed over to Russia, whose frontier was once more to be advanced to the Danube. Romania, exchanging Bessarabia for the Dobrucha taken from Turkey. And finally, Bulgaria, including eastern Rumelia and Macedonia, was to be erected into a self-governing state, temporarily occupied by Russia and guaranteed by her. But such terms could not be accepted either by Great Britain, who saw all her worst nightmares of Russians in India realized, or by Austria, who saw her cherished dream of a port on the Aegean forever falsified. Andrassy prepared to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to mobilize the army of the dual monarchy. Beaconsfield, his cabinet now united, denounced the treaty and prepared for war, concluding a secret convention with Turkey, by which England guaranteed the Asiatic dominions of the Sultan, and was to occupy Cyprus as a pledge of her good faith. But the struggle which appeared inevitable was averted. Alexander could not fight. Bismarck was enthusiastic in the cause of peace. The long-delayed Congress at last met, and the success of its deliberations saved Europe from war. For as a result of the Congress, the terms of peace agreed upon at San Stefano were ostensibly modified. The Treaty of Berlin, July 1878. Bulgaria was restricted to the territory north of the Balkans, Eastern Rumelia being granted mere self-government, and Macedonia left to the Sultan absolutely. Bosnia and Herzegovina were entrusted to Austria-Hungary to occupy and administer. Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro were declared independent, and Samos was erected into an autonomous principality. But in order that the dual monarchy might still have an outlet for southward expansion, Montenegro was deprived of the desirable ports granted her at San Stefano, and the Sanjak of Novi Pazar, left in possession of the Ottomans, formed a wedge between the two Slav states. In the matter of Greece, who had unwisely attempted to press her claims by war, the powers contented themselves with making a pious recommendation to the Sultan that something should be ceded to the Hellenic kingdom. Immediately after the conclusion of the treaty, England published her convention with Turkey and occupied Cyprus, thus morally binding herself to oppose any further dissipation of the inheritance of the sick man. Peace was thus preserved in Europe, but the Treaty of Berlin, like the treaties of Adrianople and Paris before it, failed to solve the Eastern question. And the cause of that failure is not hard to find. The treaty was an attempt to steer between the two logical extremes of maintaining and of destroying the Ottoman Empire, and it therefore suffered the fate of all half-solutions. Yet it was difficult to see how a more logical course could have been pursued. The Turks themselves precluded the possibility of a European maintenance of their empire. A declining race, they were filled with that distrust which a sense of weakness must produce, and they could no more abstain from oppressing Christians than the Christians could abstain from efforts to deliver themselves from the humiliating position assigned to them by the Koran. And in so far as the Treaty of Berlin expressed hope of an Ottoman revival, it has not been justified by later events. Even the recent triumph of progress at Constantinople gives no very sure ground for hope. Beaconsfield brought back peace from Berlin. The honour of which he boasted was more dubious. England occupied and still retains Cyprus. The Ottoman Empire has lost eastern Rumelia and Crete. Bosnia and Herzegovina have been annexed to Austria-Hungary. Bulgaria has proclaimed her independence. Yet if the maintenance of Turkish integrity be impossible, the contrary solution presents almost more insurmountable difficulties. Any tampering with the territorial status quo was rendered extremely dangerous by the mutual jealousies and suspicions of the powers. But even if Great Britain could have forgotten her distrust, and Russia and Austria their ambition, the bag and baggage policy would none the less have been far from assuring peace. For when the last Turk had crossed the Bosphorus, the conflict of nationalities in the Balkan Peninsula would only have begun, and the task of reconciling the conflicting interests of those remnants of nations would have passed the wit of the wisest diplomatists. If the Treaty of Berlin failed to provide a permanent solution for the Eastern question, it was largely because no solution could be provided which would not bear fruitful seeds of future discord. The importance of the treaty is thus rather indirect than direct, consisting in the illustration afforded by it of the motives which governed the conduct of statesmen in 1878. The 19th century has been somewhat generally regarded as the era of the triumph of nationality. But if this view be correct, then between victory and defeat there is a most marked similarity. For while the rights of peoples have nowhere secured perfect recognition, in numerous instances they have not been recognized even imperfectly. Greece still longs for her islands, and Belgium for Luxembourg. Italy sighs for her unredeemed provinces of Dalmatia, Istria, and Trent. Even Germany is obliged to remember with regret that her language is the language of millions obeying the Habsburg scepter. And at the same time, Czechs and Croats, Rumans and Poles, Bulgars and Serbs watch in vain for the dawning of a bright day of unity and freedom. The subject races of southeastern Europe feel little content in the contemplation of a Magyar triumph. In short, nationality has by no means been accepted as a principle upon which Europe should be modelled. Nor is it very difficult to explain this fact. Few European nations possess a population so homogeneous that the principle could be applied to them without peril to their very existence. The intermingling of races is often so complete that the recognition of the rights of one people almost necessarily involves the sacrifice of another. And though the theorists who championed nationality and who popularized that doctrine probably overlooked such trifles and sincerely believed in the practicality of the creed which they preached, such delusions have hardly been shared by serious politicians. To them, the doctrine was convenient. It might afford a well-sounding catchword wherewith to attract. It might supply a cloak for the concealment of less respectable ambitions and more selfish aims. They hoped to use it to assist them in the accomplishment of their designs. They hoped to discard it when it had served its purpose. Of those who trusted so to make use of nationality, Bismarck was the most prominent and skilful. He realized with his wonted perspicacity that the day of frank repression had passed. He realized that the masses were hardly enthusiasts on behalf of that ideal of national power which he set ever before him. But he did not for that despair of gaining the help of the many. He believed that whether or no the people could be corrupted, they could almost certainly be deceived. He knew that the wish of the masses was for relief from material distress, that they had been taught by Mazzini and by other idealists to look for such relief in political unity, and to expect from alien rule pangs of hunger. And of this knowledge he availed himself to win popular approval for the methods which he adopted in order to establish Prussian ascendancy in Germany and German ascendancy in Europe. Taxes were increased, conscription enforced, parliamentary government reduced to a formality in the sacred cause of unity, or, as the many understood it, in the cause of the hungry. So far from openly flouting the wishes of the people, Bismarck professedly appeared as the champion of a popular cause, as laboring to secure for the masses all that they most desired. And at first he met with complete success. Germany was unified under Prussian leadership and assumed a foremost place in the councils of the continent. But unfortunately, the Bismarck system labored under one fatal disadvantage. The cry for bread was a real cry, expressing a deeply felt need, nor could it be stilled either by the most eloquent appeals to lofty sentiment or by the attainment of the fullest measure of national glory. And when the masses discovered, as they discovered only too soon, both in Italy and in Germany, that the boasted advantages of union were so elusive as to require explanation, when they found that so far from bringing abundance of food, unity brought rather abundance of taxes and of drills, their enthusiasm for nationality was somewhat abated, and they lent a ready ear to the preachers of another gospel. Cosmopolitan ideas became prevalent. Socialism in all its myriad forms gained adherents, and the new agitation, like the old, found its ultimate basis in that permanent desire for more to eat and for more to drink, which has ever lain at the root of all political unrest. Bismarck viewed with alarm the growth of theories which he regarded as hostile to the development of national power. He became the enemy of those popular movements which he had once applauded. He advocated repression and urged resistance to the revolution with an ardor worthy of Metternich himself. Indeed, between the presiding genius of the Congress of Vienna and the presiding genius of the Congress of Berlin, the difference in policy and in principles is so slight that those who loudly acclaim the political progress of the 19th century may well restrain their optimistic feelings. It is true Bismarck did not, as Metternich had done, bluntly declare his contempt for the wishes of peoples, but Poles and Alsatians, Hanoverians and Hessians and Danes could bear testimony to the slight regard which he had shown for their aspirations and for their prejudices. It is true that he did not attempt that complete repression of all political life which had been the ideal of the Austrian Chancellor, that he never openly advocated despotism or condemned constitutional government. But the Prussian Parliament learnt from him that freedom must be subordinate to higher considerations, and the German people found that their unity involved the strictest obedience to their warlord. And if Metternich had his quadruple alliance to maintain morality and the status quo, Bismarck strove to form a league of emperors to support the selfsame cause. The conferences of sovereigns at Berlin reproduced with some exactness the conferences of Troppau and Laibach. And if political progress consists in something more vital than the mere formation of unified states, the half-recognition of nationality, and the bare acceptance of representative institutions, if political progress is a good in any true sense, then the boasted advance since the days of Metternich becomes shadowy and vague. The sum total of human happiness has been but obscurely increased. The ardor which statesmen feel for the mitigation of human woe is delicately concealed, and the Christmas message of goodwill is heard as faintly as ever amid the clash of jarring interests. Unity and freedom have been bought at a price paid in broken hearts and scalding tears of blood. And the dear purchase has done little to remove the soul-destroying tale of poverty and distress. Indeed, the liberated masses still cry in vain for bread. The crushing burden of armaments weighs daily more heavily upon the groaning peoples of the continent. Many a peasant sighs for some relief from the oppressive glory of his united nation. Many a conscript would welcome alien rule, if so he could gain power to bring comfort to a sorrowing mother. And the prevailing calm but thinly disguises the ever-present danger of storm, which hourly threatens to devastate a Europe enjoying more liberty, more taxes, and less assurance of peace. End of section 25. End of From Metternich to Bismarck, a textbook of European history by Lionel Cecil, Jane. Read by Pamela Nagami, M.D., in Encino, California, December 2024.